Welcome to How to Real Estate Podcast, a podcast to help you start, elevate, and catapult your real estate investing career. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any new podcasts that we post every single Monday. Jared tested.
Jana approved.
Hi guys, welcome to How to Real Estate. This is Jared.
And this is Jana.
And this is the podcast that helps you start, elevate, and catapult your real estate investing career.
Today's guest, we're very excited. She started with investing in her early 20s with her husband, and only 7 years later, they have over 50 units, buy and holds that they've purchased along the way. Mainly single-family homes, but they have duplexes and fourplexes, and they're just diving into assisted living facilities and looking into a mobile home park. So we have a lot to learn. She's going to be going over how you finance a buy and hold, 15 ways on how to finance a buy and hold. Welcome to the podcast, Shazia Chiu.
Hey guys, thank you so much.
Hey, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. It's really
I
exciting.
really appreciate you coming on. I know you're a busy person, so we appreciate you coming on and sharing some of your knowledge and wisdom. 50 units in 7 years, that's very impressive. I have to say.
Yeah, it's been a ride for sure. There's been a lot of work that's gone into it, a lot of ups and downs, but we feel really fortunate to be where we're at now. So
yeah,
great.
So that's amazing. And you and your husband have been partners in crime doing this whole thing, which it's pretty awesome to have. All right.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people say like, oh, I could never work with a spouse, but I feel like I couldn't work without him. So we've been
sweet.
Very fortunate to get along so well through everything that's happened.
Yeah. No, that's amazing.
Over the time or over the course, have you guys found a balance? Like, is somebody better at acquiring properties and the other one handles a different aspect of the business?
Yeah, I would definitely say that my husband Taylor is more of the numbers guy. So he is very good at the analysis and at finding properties. I've found some properties as well. And generally right now I'm heading up our flips, which is sort of a new venture for us and kind of a new way that we're expanding with real estate. And then we're both all hands on deck with the assisted living facility. With something like that, there's just so much to do that you can't really have one person handle it all. So I feel like we kind of fill in the gaps for one another, which makes everything work quite smoothly.
That's awesome.
Nice. Yeah. Those
Great.
assisted living facilities, I hear there's a lot of, they're just completely different. It's a completely different animal than all the other stuff that there's out there. So
yeah,
it's hard to go. How long have you had it?
We've only had it 3 weeks at this point, so it's very fresh. Yeah, very fresh. And it's hard to even call it real estate in the same way that you would, refer to a buy and hold property or a flip, just because there's so much more to it than the real estate. It's kind of a separate business of its own, but there are some investors that specialize in those types of properties. So it kind of still falls under the umbrella.
Right. It's amazing. So one thing that a lot of investors, when they first starting out, like they're getting into real estate because they like the big checks of doing flips and whatnot. But reality, the sweetest thing about real estate is getting the passive income, getting those checks in the mail, having property managers, so you're not have to worry about a ton of things. But one of the holdups a lot of people have is just getting it financed, their actual buy and holds. And so I think this podcast, this subject is so important, and I'm really, really excited to talk about this because I'm ready to take like so many notes. It's gonna be insane. So tell us about we talked about 15 different ways to actually finance. Can you start breaking down a few of them? Maybe how you finance the first couple, or I'd love to hear all this stuff. I'm so excited.
Yeah, sure. So something that I think is helpful to point out and that I feel is pretty relevant to our situation is that when we first got started, we really did not have that much. I mean, we had decent jobs, but we weren't coming from this background of family money. We didn't have some big inheritance. We didn't have these killer salaries each year. We were just kind of your average Joes starting out. I was still in school at the time, so I had nothing coming in myself. But got started out on a pretty basic level. And another thing to note too is that these strategies that I'm identifying here, when we first started, we did not know about all of these. These are things that we learned along the way. And so I would definitely encourage people to always be researching, always be learning and talking to people about different methods, because you can learn so much just by that alone. So our first property we actually purchased on a VA loan. So this was a duplex that we bought And my husband was in the Marine Corps Reserves, and so he qualified for a Veterans Affairs loan. And those are guaranteed in part through the Veterans Affairs Department, and they're only available to veterans. And there are some limitations on that. I'm not positive exactly what they are. It's always helpful to talk to a lender if you have any questions on any of these loan products, because there are tons of complexities and nuances that I'll say now, I do not know all the details, but we've used the VA loan a couple of times, and the biggest benefit to this loan is that there's no down payment. So oftentimes when people want to get into a home, they have to save up a significant amount of money in order to cover the down payment and the closing costs and all these fees associated with purchasing the home. And that can be a big limitation because even if you have great credit or if you have a high income, if you don't have that down payment, you're not really going anywhere as far as buying a home goes. So with VA loans, this program was instituted to help veterans get into homes. And so in order to do that, they don't require that down payment. There's also no mortgage insurance, which is really awesome. So anybody who owns a home may realize that if you put down, I think it's less than 20%. Again, that's a detail if you'll want to check on with your lender. But I think if it's less than 20%, then you may owe PMI, or private mortgage insurance. And so that's just basically something that banks use as a hedge to protect themselves, because they're saying, hey, you're only putting in a pretty small amount of money compared to the overall cost of the loan. So to protect ourselves, we're going to charge this insurance in case you default. But what's nice with the Veterans Affairs loan is that you're not charged that PMI every month. And that can actually save you hundreds of dollars depending on the loan. So there are also some limits on how much lenders can charge for closing costs. Just kind of depends again on specifics that you'd have to check with someone who knows the loans really well.
So I have a question on the VA loan.
Yeah.
They're okay with getting a VA loan even if it's investment property, or do you have to live there for a certain amount of time and then you can move out, or how does that work? Do you know?
Yeah, so that's a good question. You do need to own or occupy for a certain amount of time. I believe that it is a year. Again, not quite positive on that, but you do need to own or occupy for a certain amount of time before you can rent it out. So that is something to be aware of when you're using this product. That's why it worked out so well for us as our first investment, because we bought a duplex, we lived downstairs, and then we were able to rent out the upstairs while we owner occupied. And we were able to purchase a duplex with it as well. I'm not sure if you can purchase a triplex or a fourplex or anything above that with the VA loan, but it was an option for buying that multifamily home, which was really nice. Just a couple of other things to be aware of with it. So it is important to know that in some cases there are limits on the amount of VA loan financing that you can get, and that varies depending on your county. And again, that's like one of those really nuanced points, but when you're speaking with a lender, you can figure out what the limits might be depending on the county you live in. And something else that's pretty huge to be aware of is that if you are a veteran and you have a disability rating, so if you're receiving any sort of disability pay from the government due to your service, then they'll also waive that funding fee on the VA loan, which can save you around 2% of the loan's value. Again, that might vary, but that's a pretty huge savings as well for people who may have disabilities and need to save more money up front. So that's a really awesome perk for using that.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and that was the first loan we used to get into our initial property. So that kind of started off this entire journey.
So you went into it thinking that? Did you talk to the loan officer and say, hey, we're planning on getting a duplex. Is that something we can do? Or did you already know? Did you do your research beforehand?
Yeah, so we were lucky to have a great realtor that we worked with at the time and a really solid lender. And so they knew that product in and out. The realtor himself was a veteran, and so he had used that. So they were able to kind of help us figure out the ropes on that, just because there is so much to know and so much that you're unaware of when you're first starting out. So that's kind of another, I guess, tangential tip, but it's huge to have a mentor or somebody that you can really lean on and rely on for help through the process.
Right, of course. That's awesome. VA loans. I'm gonna join the military just so I can get it. Just so I can get access
to buy a house.
Yeah, it's one of the best perks for sure.
Right.
It's a great product.
Great. So what are some other ways that you're able to finance some of your deals?
Yeah, so one of the ones that we ended up using after the VA loan, and this one's a little bit lesser known, but one of the local banks in our area was offering an investor loan. So sometimes banks or credit unions will have these investor loans that have somewhat friendlier terms for people who are looking to buy investor properties. So there are usually not owner occupation limits, and the down payment on ours was a lot lower than it might have been. I think we did 10% down on a 30-year note, and the interest rate was reasonable as well. I don't recall it off the top of my head now, but this allowed us to acquire some of the new build townhomes in our area shortly after we got that first duplex. So we just used our own cash to pay for the down payments on those, because by that time we'd been able to save up some money from the cash flow on our initial property, as well as just from my husband working. So we were able to use the investor loan to go ahead, and I think we purchased maybe 2 properties on that particular loan, 2 or 3.
Oh, cool. Wow. So you're able to do like umbrella loans, so one loan for multiple properties, right? Is that kind of how that worked?
Oh no, those were actually individual investor loans. Although I do have one on my list that is for multiple properties where you bundle them
cool.
together.
Well, that's awesome.
She's like, we're not there yet. On to number 3.
Quick,
It's just a lot. I've tried to organize it all. Yeah, so the next one after that investor loan, we kind of started changing our strategy a bit. And anybody who's looked into investing thoroughly may be aware that out in the Midwest, there are properties that are a lot less expensive than properties you might find on the East Coast or the West Coast. Oh, yeah. And so we began looking into some of the markets out there, and homes in that part of the country, some of them are inexpensive enough that you can actually just go ahead and purchase them in cash. And when I say purchase in cash, I'm thinking the amount of, around $25,000 to $50,000 per property. And granted, there's some important things to know about these properties. They're usually in less desirable areas. They may need a lot of work. You need to be mindful of the crime rates in these areas. There's just things that are important to know once you start investing in the Midwest. But essentially, after we were buying these properties in our home state, we decided to branch out and start investing out of state. And at that point, we began using cash to buy properties. So with this approach, if you have enough cash saved up, you can just buy homes outright. And this is convenient for getting deals done fast, and it can just save you, thousands of dollars in interest over the life of the loan. And of course, you can buy any property in cash. If you have enough cash, you could buy $1 million home. Right. That definitely was not us. We were buying these cheaper, more affordable homes outright. So go ahead.
So you were taking your cash flow from your other properties. So you had like your duplex and your maybe I don't know how the time frame works, but townhomes, and you're taking the cash. You weren't just spending on living a high life. You were actually taking the money, saving it, and then when you had enough to buy like $25,000, $30,000, put it on to buy property in cash in a different state. That's what you guys did. Is that in a nutshell?
Yeah, exactly. So, and by that point too, we were starting to get to the point in our lives where I was working as well. I believe I graduated by that point. And so I was making some money too. And so we were able to live, and we always have just lived extremely frugally to try to save for more properties and to keep growing. And that really just comes down to prioritizing. There are a lot of people out there, as we know, who make decent money, but they don't often save it. And so it does take kind of a conscious approach to decide, okay, I'm going to save money. I'm going to save my cash flow. I'm going to build a strategy that allows me to keep acquiring and keep growing instead of just, blowing it on fun stuff. And of course, you need a mix. You need to enjoy life too. But for us, especially at that point in our lives, we were very focused on growth and on continuing to acquire. So the cash purchases have mostly been those inexpensive homes out in the Midwest. And something that I keep in mind when it comes to buying in cash, we try to balance the benefits of throwing cash at one purchase versus being able to fund down payments for multiple purchases. So for example, if you have one chunk of cash, we'll just use a round number to make it simple. If you have $100,000, maybe you could buy a home for $100,000 and then you'd have one property. Or you could potentially take that $100,000 and split that into 2 down payments of $50,000 each, which may allow you to acquire 2 properties that might each cash flow and might each have equity benefits. So that's something to keep in mind when you're using cash, is just figuring out what is the best way to utilize these funds. So.
That's awesome.
What did you, investing in the Midwest, again, you were saying that you guys had saved up and you went that route so that you could buy it full, in cash. What made you decide that route versus using it on a down payment here locally or somewhere else?
Yeah, that's a good question. So at the time, we were really interested in expanding to other markets and just seeing, what else was out there. And we had our foothold pretty strongly here in our local market. And so as far as using cash for those purchases, since these homes were significantly cheaper than a normal home, it's a little bit hard to find loans for homes that are that inexpensive. Banks are not really interested in lending on a, $25,000, $30,000, maybe even $50,000 home. And so it was kind of out of necessity at that point. Plus, we were buying through wholesalers. And so anybody who's bought through wholesalers may be familiar with the fact that you're often either buying in cash or using a hard money loan just because you need those deals to close really quick. So it was kind of just a confluence of things that made it necessary for us to buy them in cash.
Hmm. Yeah, that's crazy that, your mind just goes, oh, let's check out the Midwest.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there were some precipitating events. It's hard for me to remember now since it was
Yeah.
a few years back, but we've always tried to be pretty creative and open-minded when it comes to different areas. So another way that we accelerated our growth out in the Midwest and here at home too is by using HELOCs. So HELOCs are home equity lines of credit. And basically, they allow you to tap into the equity that you've got in an asset so that you can use that money now instead of waiting to sell the home. So when you see billboards advertising HELOCs, it's often like, oh, use this money for your home renovation project, or you can use it, to take a vacation even. You can do whatever you want with it. But for us, we used it to keep growing our business. And so we were able to take some of those townhomes and duplexes and fourplexes that we owned back here at home and to tap that equity. And once we had pulled the cash out from it, we could use that to go ahead and acquire more properties. So a HELOC is basically like a loan on your home's equity. So you're paying interest and you do have monthly payments as well. So it's not like you just can use this money with no consequence. There's obviously some strings attached to it. But honestly, HELOCs fueled a lot of our growth from being around that 10 unit mark and getting up to the 50 unit mark. So we used that credit to purchase more properties, and then we would pay off the HELOCs as we sold units, or if we had savings and wanted to just kind of cut down on the amount of HELOC money that we had extended. Something that I like to point out with HELOCs that I feel is pretty important is it's important to know that banks can shut down those lines of credit if the economy is in bad shape. So for example, right before everything hit with COVID, we actually went ahead and extended some of our HELOCs and just pulled that cash out so that a bank couldn't come back and say, hey, you have basically this line of credit for $50,000, but you're not using it, so we're just going to close it off. So that's something to be mindful of if the economy is ever taking a turn and you are in a position where you can safely have that monthly payment and make those payments on your HELOCs, but you also could use a chunk of cash at that time. It's definitely wise to look into the possibility of just pulling those funds out. Right. And then of course you want to use them toward an acquisition or a project or something that will benefit you so that it's not just sitting there and burning a hole in your pocket with those interest payments.
And the beauty of that is, like, because it's a line of credit, I mean, it's with barring the extreme cases, like when the company goes down, they block it off, but you can basically take your cash flow and stick it in the HELOC and still have access to that money pretty much at will without having to pay the interest when you kind of park it there for a moment. So HELOCs are one of my favorite strategies. So I'm glad you brought that up. That's awesome.
Yeah, that one's really awesome. And I think a lot of people don't realize the potential of it. But if you have properties and even your own primary residence, if you've been living in a home for a while and you're interested in getting into investing, I mean, definitely look and see how much equity you have and if that's something you can tap, because it could be really beneficial to you. And I think people are often scared off by this idea of having, air quotes, debt. It is true debt in a sense, but if you're using it to grow and you're using it strategically, and if your tenants are good and they're paying on time and you're able to keep your whole operation together, then it's good debt that's helping you grow and helping you thrive.
Right, definitely.
So I can move right along with another strategy that
Yeah.
we used. So this one's pretty creative, and I was very skeptical at the time just because it seemed a little bit like, oh, I don't know if I want to mess with that. But one of the next strategies we used is 0% APR credit cards. So basically, this involves using credit cards that don't charge any interest for a set amount of time, normally a year, to purchase more properties. So in our case, we got introduced to a company that specializes in helping people use this strategy. So they would suggest various types of cards to us and walk us through the application process on each of these cards and basically helped us get what we need in order to reach our goals. So then what happens is once you have the cards, you can access those cash balances through getting a cash advance on the credit card. So something to be mindful of is that some credit card companies will charge transfer fees, I think is what they're called, balance transfer fees, in order to access that cash. However, there are certain cards out there that don't carry the balance transfer fees. So the strategy that we used was we tried to identify these cards that didn't have those fees, and then we would go ahead and pull the balance of the cash from those, and then we'd be able to buy more of those Midwest properties in cash, and then we would just have payments on the cards that didn't involve any interest during that 12-month period. So of course, the idea with that strategy is that ideally you want to be in a position where you can pay those cards off before the 12-month period dries up, because then you won't have paid any interest. You will have essentially gotten this sum of money through a credit card, and then you will have paid it all off and you won't have interest payments, which is awesome.
Right.
The most important thing to know about this strategy that we kind of had learned the hard way is that it can negatively impact your credit if you aren't careful. So you do need to be really mindful about all the ways that you're using your credit, how many lines you have open at once, how extended you are. Keep on top of your credit score, because we definitely found that as we got toward the end with paying off these cards that we didn't have as high of a credit score as we wanted to have. And so we had to knock out that debt pretty fast to get back to where we wanted to be. But it is a very creative strategy and it can work quite well.
Awesome. How many credit cards would you have to put together to kind of transfer? I mean, how many credit cards, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh gosh, I honestly don't remember off the top of my head. I wouldn't be surprised if it was somewhere between 3 and 5 credit cards. We didn't do anything too aggressive with it. But prior to getting into real estate, my husband and I have always been really passionate about traveling. And so we got really into travel hacking. And basically that's using credit cards to get points for travel. And so we were quite familiar with how that whole system worked. And we were comfortable with the idea of using cards in order to purchase something. And we kind of understood the nuances there. So yeah, we had probably 20 or 30 cards prior to that because of travel hacking. And that kind of helped us.
Yeah, that's awesome.
That'll be on another episode, right? The travel hacking.
Yeah. Seriously, that's an awesome thing to be aware of too. If you can save money on travel, it's a really great thing to do.
I'll have to talk to you after.
Totally, yeah. Right. All right, I have more strategies for you guys if you're ready.
Okay. Bring them on.
It's like drinking from a fire hose, but we love it.
So another strategy that we've used several times is a 1031 exchange. So we finally decided to sell that duplex, the first one we had bought. I believe that was a few years ago now. So basically a 1031 exchange is a pretty common setup that you can use that allows you to avoid capital gains taxes when you're selling properties. Because normally if you go to sell a property, and again, this is one of those things where I don't know all the specifics, but you can be on the hook for quite a bit of taxes when you go to sell a home, especially, an investment property. And so a 1031 exchange allows you to take the funds, the proceeds that you get from the sale of one property, and to apply those to another real estate purchase. So it's not the type of thing where you can take those funds and be like, okay, now I'm going to go buy a new car and not have to pay taxes. It's the type of thing where you actually have to use it in a like-for-like purchase, as they call it. So you have to be obtaining some sort of real estate. So there are some rules regarding this, as usual. So you have to identify and purchase the next home within a specific time frame in order for the whole 1031 exchange to work out. And you can work with your lender or your title company, and they'll help you kind of understand what those limitations are. And usually what happens is if you decide, hey, I want to do a 1031 exchange on the sale of a property, then you just work with the title company and they'll go ahead and hold your proceeds in escrow in a 1031 account. And then when it's time to close on the purchase of the next property, they just go ahead and pull from those funds, and you don't even really see the money and you don't even have to deal with it. So we actually went ahead and used a 1031 exchange to purchase that assisted living facility in part.
Ooh, cool.
And those proceeds were from the sale of a residential property. So at first I wondered, is it really like for like, because it's kind of buying something different, but it did work out very well in our situation. And we were able to shield all of those proceeds from taxes by buying something that fit within those parameters.
And it resets the depreciation too on the property. So instead of wait the 27, starts over the clock in the new property, get the depreciation. It's awesome.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'd totally forgotten about that in my notes.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a great strategy for avoiding those taxes. It does involve a little bit of legwork, just because you do have to quickly identify another property that will make sense numbers wise. And you kind of have to be ready to move forward with another purchase, which I don't know how other people are, but when I sell something, I'm always like, okay, I want to sit back, take a breather, figure out my next moves. But in real estate, things are always moving so fast. That's something I've learned to be comfortable with, is there's not usually time for hesitation when you're making a big decision like this. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, moving right along.
So
another loan product that we went ahead and used recently is an SBA loan. So with everything that's happening right now with the pandemic, people have heard a lot about the SBA and about the funding options that they're providing. But pre-pandemic, there have been SBA loans for a long time now. And those are basically loans that are offered through the Small Business Administration. And there are lenders out there that specialize in these loans just because they are more complex. There are some more details that you need to be aware of. And because they're designed to benefit small businesses, there are limitations in place on the amount that you can borrow depending on your industry. And I think that in some industries, you can't use them at all. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not positive on that, but there are limitations just so that the loans are actually benefiting small businesses. So there are several basic programs, the 7A program, 504 program, microloans, and disaster loans. And they're all kind of different in terms of their purposes and in terms of, who can qualify for them and what they involve. So what we found with going through the process, we used an SBA loan to get the assisted living facility. And you and the business have to meet some pretty stringent requirements to qualify for the loans, and there's just a ton of documentation involved. Again, anybody who's been in real estate and who has done transactions knows that there's just a mountain load of documents to keep on top of. But with SBA loans, it's almost like a new level, because the government really wants to know, what do you intend to use the funds for? Is this something that they actually want to underwrite? And they want to be quite involved in the process. So that's kind of the basics of SBA loans, and those are so complicated. I just kind of, again, you want to rely on a lender for learning the specifics of those.
Well, and that's good. At the very least, it points a lot of our listeners to where they can start asking questions about, when they're talking to their lenders. So at least they know about the general concept of what SBA loan is, so they can kind of get the final details about with their lenders. So that's great.
Yeah, definitely. So another type of loan too, which I maybe should have mentioned this one earlier because it's by far one of the most common ones that people use, is a conventional loan. But we didn't use a conventional loan until we were several years into our investing career. We were just using these other strategies that I mentioned. But conventional loans are basically conventional. A lot of people use them for residential purchases and even for investment purchases. So on those, the down payment percentage can vary depending on the kind of the loan, and the amortization schedule can vary too, but I think it's typically 15 to 30 years. So of course, to qualify for that, it's pretty straightforward, but banks want to look at your income and your credit and your debt to income ratio and just other basic indicators to help them feel comfortable lending their money to you. Mm-hmm. So the funny thing with us, though, is that the conventional loan that we ended up getting was actually the most complicated for us to get. And that's because we ended up buying a cabin as our primary residence. And the cabin was located in kind of a recreational development. And so for some reason, the lenders and the underwriters just had a really hard time wrapping their minds around using a conventional loan for this type of purchase, even though the neighborhood had plenty of people who were long-term occupants. And so, the ironic thing is just in our case, the conventional loan was the most complicated one we've ever used. And there were quite a few moments along the way where we thought we weren't actually going to get it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, normally though, people don't have a ton of issues with a conventional loan. It's pretty straightforward and usually pretty simple to qualify for if you meet all the requirements. Yeah, and then I guess one that fits in pretty well with that too, and this is one we have not used, but it is very common, is the FHA loan. So I added it to my list just because it is such a common product and a lot of people start out with it. Generally, you're putting down 3.5 to 5%, and the loans are insured by the Federal Housing Administration. So again, pretty basic. It allows people to get into homes much quicker than if you were needing to save up 20% for a down payment under a conventional loan. And again, there's some basic requirements. Need a decent credit score, but the down payment's a lot smaller, so there's kind of some upside there. As far as I'm aware, FHA loans do carry private mortgage insurance, which means that you'll need to pay some of that each month, which can be, several $100s. And again, we haven't used this one just because there are some restrictions on obtaining it if you already have other properties. And I believe there's owner occupation restrictions too. It's something I haven't looked into for a while, but as somebody who's just starting out, that is a good one to investigate.
It's a great way to do if you're doing like house hacking, like you're doing like a duplex or fourplex, you live in one unit. So it's a great way to kind of start things out. It's a good idea.
All right. At this point in our investing career, this was probably within the last 3 years, we had gotten to the point where we felt pretty confident with what we were doing and the things that we knew. So we began utilizing private money loans. So private money basically refers to cash that people invest with you directly. So these people could be your family, your friends, or your acquaintances. And these are super convenient and flexible because you're basically agreeing together on the amount of the loan, the interest rate, the terms, and the repayment process. So it's almost as if these people you're lending from are the banks and you are setting up the documentation with them and setting all the terms with them as well. So you can structure these in a myriad of ways. You could make monthly interest payments to the person that you're borrowing the money from, or you can pay all that interest at the end as a lump sum. I think the most important thing to be aware of with this strategy is that it's pretty essential to have a track record before you start using this, just because unfortunately there are a lot of people out there who misuse investor funds, and we all hear stories of that from time to time, or they just kind of get in over their heads and they don't know exactly what they're doing, but they're taking other people's money and using it. So there are some, very fundamental things to be aware of. Obviously, you want to have good paperwork set up, ideally drawn up by attorneys that protects both you and the borrower, you and the lender. And you have to be aware of some rules too. You can't just go onto Facebook and be like, hey guys, anybody want to fund my deal? Because there are rules and regulations around private borrowing. And it's also really important to be careful about how you use the actual funds. You don't want to be commingling investors' money with other funds when you've specifically stated that these funds will be used for a certain project or certain property. And with this kind of thing, I feel like a lot of it is just common sense. It's about being trustworthy and being transparent and being careful and treating someone's money, more importantly and more carefully than you would even treat your own. But unfortunately, a lot of people out there, again, kind of misuse this. And so you hear a lot of horror stories. I would say some of the most important things to keep in mind are just to always have an exit strategy. If you tell somebody, hey, I'm going to have your funds back to you in 12 months, then you better know how you're going to get their funds back to them in 12 months, whether that involves selling the property or refinancing it or some other creative way to make sure that you can get their money back. And I know that for me, ultimately, when I borrow from somebody, I decide, okay, even if this requires me just paying them this money back out of my personal savings, that is kind of the obligation that you agree to. So we, I believe, have raised, hundreds of thousands of dollars at this point for buy and hold purchases as well as flips. So wow. It's something that has helped us to grow and has also been mutually beneficial for the investors too, because they're getting a higher return on their money than they would normally get with other types of investments. And we have a pretty constant flow of projects too. So they're able to reinvest those funds and to keep growing with us, which is really awesome.
And have you, and this may be further down your list, but have you had those people like actually instead of just be a lender, but being a partner? So they're actually like they put in the money, but they're getting percentage of is that further down the list?
Yes, this is
Oh,
on
I'm
my
totally
list.
done. Okay, sorry.
No, you're
Be
good. I'm just
patient.
cruising right
I know,
along.
I'll be patient. I'm sorry.
No, you're trying.
It's easy.
I kind of have gone out of order. I was trying to put
No,
them
you're good.
into kind of a more logical order at first, but I realized
Right,
that, yeah, as you get with some of these methods, you just have to kind of lump them all together. But
right.
the next one that I have on my list, it's actually changing gears a little bit, but it's hard money loans. So as far as buy and hold properties go, you're probably not going to use hard money loans very often, but they are still worthwhile to know about just because they are another creative method of financing that you can use if you want to acquire more properties. So hard money loans are typically used to buy homes that have major issues or that need significant rehab work. And this is usually because banks don't want to lend on a property that has foundation problems or that looks, like it was a hoarder house. Those are things that banks normally don't want to touch. So hard money lenders kind of step in to fill in the gap there for people who are flipping houses. And you can find all kinds of different terms when it comes to hard money loans. So just some of the examples of things I've seen, loan to value amounts will vary a little bit. Sometimes it's, 75% that the lender will fund, or you can get 100% if the deal's good enough. A pretty common term length is around 6 months, and there are upfront fees that you need to pay that are called points. And this can vary. 2 points is pretty common, but I've even seen up to 5 points on certain types of loans.
Wow.
So you may be making monthly payments, but lenders may also allow you to pay all the interest at the end as a lump sum. And sometimes lenders will lend on repairs as well, which is really awesome if you're doing flips, because when you're buying a flip, you're not only having to account for the down payment and for the cost of acquiring the property, but you also need to have a strategy for getting all of the repairs done. And so it's nice when lenders can lend on repairs as well. So a common misconception that I actually had about hard money before I began using these loans is that I, for some reason, thought they would not require much of anything out of pocket. And again, it's possible to get ones that don't require a ton out of pocket if you go ahead and find like 100% loan to value option. But that's pretty rare. From what I've seen, you're often coming in with somewhere between, 10 or 20% down, and then you're paying points as well as closing costs. So that's something to be aware of. And the last note that I would make on hard money loans is just that it's really important and pretty crucial to understand fully what you're getting and to know the penalties of extending beyond your original loan term. So normally lenders will charge maybe an extra point if you have to go beyond your 6-month or 9-month term. But there can also be interest penalties or other forms of penalties that you really need to be cognizant of so that you don't end up in hot water. And something I would suggest too is if you talk to a lender about a loan and you aren't totally satisfied with the terms, definitely shop around and try to see what other hard money options are out there, because there are usually quite a few lenders in any given area that specialize in those types of loans. And the last note that I'd make on that is if you're flipping and using that strategy, definitely account for all of your money costs and don't forget to calculate that interest thoroughly and those points so that you know exactly what you'll be getting out of it. So again, that's not really a buy and hold strategy, but it is one that I've used and one that can work for an acquisition of a property.
Sure.
Yeah, because they can always refinance, like if they acquire the property. So it
Right.
would help in a buy and hold.
Yeah, exactly. Because like if
buying
you're
a
buying
property-
from,
Sorry.
go ahead.
I was gonna say if they're buying a property from like a wholesaler or somebody that has closed quickly or can't necessarily go through the whole 30 days wait, just get it in your name or in your company's name and then refinance like Jenna was saying. Yeah.
So another loan, guys, we're getting toward the end here.
Great.
I think we're banging through most of these, which is awesome. But this was a pretty creative one that we used about a year ago. So this is called a portfolio loan. And this goes back to what we were saying earlier with the idea of bundling several properties together. So basically a portfolio loan involves wrapping several properties into one big loan. And what's nice about this loan is it's technically a commercial loan, so it doesn't count against your personal loan limit. So again, this is something you'll run into as you're learning about real estate investing, is that there are limits to how many loans you can have in your own name. And commercial loans are nice just because you can kind of get around that. So in our case, we went ahead and we took 5 of the properties that we owned in the Midwest that we had purchased in cash, and we wrapped those into one loan. And so that allowed us to pull out all of that cash from those homes. And now we just make a monthly payment on the loan like you would any other type of loan. So the strategy is pretty helpful because it allows you to kind of consolidate and then tap into cash that you may have invested into properties in the past. And we were able to use the funds from that loan to purchase some flips as well as buy and hold properties. So it was really beneficial in our case. I think the main downside with this type of product is that if you want to sell one property, you do need to account for what you're going to do with the other properties in that portfolio. I don't know if you would be forced to essentially sell all of them or if there's some other out, but you do have to kind of treat those properties as one whole at that point. So those are pretty interesting as well.
It's almost like turning it's essentially turning like 5 properties, 10 properties, however many it is, almost into like a multifamily type of scenario, because it's kind of all or nothing, or depending on how the loan's written. I mean, obviously find out before you actually sign papers, but sometimes I've heard, I've had mentors where they've had portfolio loans and they have it, and I can't remember the wording, so I don't want to try to butcher anything, but where if they sell one property out of there's 5 properties, and they sell this one property, they have to pay back X percent of that loan with that sell of the property. So they can sell it individually, but it really depends on how it's written and how it's underwritten and everything. So yeah, definitely read.
Well, that's good to know. Yeah, I learned something because I didn't even realize that you had to account for them. And it makes sense. I'm sure that there's something in the way that it's written that allows you to kind of navigate that, because I'm sure it's a common thing.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's good.
Awesome. Well, the next one that we have used, and a lot of these have actually been recent. A lot of these strategies we've used within the last year, so they're still pretty fresh on my mind, which is great. But seller financing. So this is another creative method. We use this to help with some of the down payment funding on the assisted living facility, just because it was a larger purchase. And with the SBA loan, we needed to come in with a sizable down payment. And so we were able to work that out with the seller where they would cover some of that down payment, but we would be paying them. So in this case, the seller is basically like the bank, and your payments go to them. And you work with them to agree on terms. You can agree on, a monthly payment or how long the loan will be, what the interest rate will be. And it's nice just because it's extremely flexible and it's designed to benefit both sides. It's also helpful in cases where a bank might not lend on a property. So kind of similar to what we were saying with hard money loans, if a property needs a ton of work, or if there's some other issue with it that makes it not really lendable, a seller may still be very motivated to get rid of it, in which case they might be willing to offer seller financing. I think the main downside with this strategy is that sometimes sellers are not open to it just because they don't want to deal with the hassle of having to collect payments, and they just want to rinse their hands completely of the property. That said, though, you can still find a lot of options out there on seller financing, and it's always worth asking if you're really interested in something.
And the cool thing is that a lot of times when they think about seller financing deal, they have to. Some people think that you have to have the whole deal financed by seller financing, but that's not the case. Like you brought this up, where you need a big down payment. So it's a great way to negotiate. Like, hey, I'll buy this property at your price, but I need you to carry back the last 100,000. I'll pay you cash the rest, or you'll get your money, the rest of the money, the other 400 or however much it is, right? But carry back this last 100,000, and then you're going to get the rest of your money. So it's not like, okay, I'm still getting a lot of money and get my price and I'm getting what I want. So it's just this one last part is going to be a little later than the rest of it. So, I mean, yeah, you can definitely portion, and they're basically going to hold like a second position on the loan or on the property, I should say. So, yeah,
precisely. So they still have a lot of protection, and it's very, it's great in cases where sellers are motivated, but they're not really getting as many buyer leads as they'd like. I don't think there's anything wrong with presenting options for seller financing and seeing if it's something they're interested in, because ultimately it does benefit both sides if it's structured well.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's amazing. Yeah, that's one of my favorite subjects, by the way, seller financing. I can talk, and Janet knows, I can talk about it for hours.
Oh yeah, no, that's awesome. There's so much to learn. We went to a seminar where we were just taught all these different strategies, and honestly, we haven't really had the chance to put it into motion yet. There's still a lot that we want to explore with seller financing, but it is one of the best ways to get properties for sure.
Oh, definitely. It's amazing.
I'm on my final 2 reasons now. I hope we're doing all right with time.
Doing great.
Great. So another creative strategy that you can use is applying your realtor commission to a purchase. So as you might gather from the name, this strategy really only applies to realtors. So something though that's pretty common is that investors who do a lot of business, they may ultimately end up deciding to go ahead and get a real estate license just because they're acquiring a lot. And over time, that 3% or so that you're paying to your agents definitely adds up. And so in our case, we're both licensed, and we decided to do that a couple of years back just because we were doing enough volume at that point that it made sense. And, you know, at a basic level, when a realtor buys or sells a home for somebody, they generally get a commission, and that amount can vary, but it's normally somewhere between 1% and 3%, occasionally more, just sort of depends on the circumstances. So if you have a real estate license, you can go ahead and set things up with the title company or the lender to potentially apply that commission that you would make to your down payment. So for an example, let's just say that you're buying a house that requires a $30,000 down payment, and you stand to make a $10,000 commission off of that purchase as the realtor. So you could set things up to apply that $10,000 commission to your down payment. So now you only need to bring in $20,000 of cash. So, I mean, ultimately you're still spending your own money, but some of it is coming through in the form of that commission, which makes things a little bit easier if you're trying to acquire something and you're just kind of on the cusp of being where you need to be with the money you're bringing to the table. So I think the pretty essential thing to remember with this strategy is that you do still need to account for taxes on that commission, as far as I'm aware. I'm not sure if there's any way to get around that. But because of that, you'll want to account for that accordingly and make sure you're in a position to pay those taxes on that commission, even if you've applied it to a purchase. But that can be a great way, if you're licensed, to go ahead and reap the benefits of that license on your purchases.
All right, that's amazing. Yeah, it just gives that last little reach of your down payment that you're missing. That's a great idea.
Yeah, so we we were going to use that one on the assisted living facility, but we ultimately ended up not needing to. So that was just kind of something in our back pocket, though, if we wanted to make things a little bit easier.
Oh, sweet.
So I am on to the final reason now, final method of funding, which is a partnership. So partnerships can be a really great way to acquire more properties. So generally, when you form a partnership with somebody, or I guess you could have one with multiple people. In our case, we just partnered with one other person. But generally, people have specific roles. So it's common to see somebody who's like a money person and somebody who's a knowledge person. So the money person might be responsible for funding all the acquisitions of properties so that you can actually purchase them. And then the knowledge person might be responsible for finding and acquiring those properties and dealing with all the day-to-day management and other similar things. And you can set up a partnership in all kinds of ways. So the splits can vary a lot depending on people's responsibilities. It's pretty common between two people to see 50-50, where you're both reaping the benefits of the equity and the cash flow. I think what's pretty crucial is just having a trustworthy relationship and being on the same page as your partner, because it can be really disappointing if you set something up and then you guys aren't really on the same page, or you're struggling to work well together. So, you know, I think the upside to this arrangement is it does allow you to grow, just because sometimes we all know if you're buying properties, cash is king, and you need that funding. And so finding somebody who's willing to supply that can really catapult you to the next level. The downside, though, is that you are getting less of each deal that you do. So I think it's important to use that strategy carefully. I know for us that whenever we can acquire something on our own, that's normally our first course of action and our first plan. But it's good to always have a partnership as an option in your back pocket so that you can still perform on deals and still keep growing, even if you are getting less of the pie. And I also think that partnerships are awesome for getting your foot into the door with something new. So as long as you have something to offer that you can bring to the table, maybe in this case, you're the money person and you can fund something, but you're afraid of going into an investment without having all the knowledge. Well, if you have that funding to offer, sometimes you can find people who have the knowledge who would be willing to work with you. So there are just a lot of different ways that you can take a partnership, many different benefits to it. Just again, it's important to have ironclad documentation and a strong basis of trust and good communication, because all of that is really crucial for keeping your partnership in healthy shape. Right. So that is it. That is 15 awesome ways to fund deals.
We did it.
Yeah. And I love the partnership one. I really do. That's I think it's really smart. And as you mentioned, that you want to make sure you have a good agreement. And like I learned this the hard way in many ways. Some of my partnerships I had, you have when you start a partnership, you may be getting along very well. But later on in 6 months, 2 years, especially if it's buy and hold, it could be a 10-year relationship. Who knows? So you want to have everything written down while you both agree. And then so when 5 years down the road, when you're like hating each other, okay, well, at least we're not relying on that handshake, relying on this piece of paper that what it says. So it's super important to get everything written down and get a lawyer to mock things up. So it's all in the legalese. It's very, just plan that you're going to eventually hate each other, and then plan importantly, and then honestly, and then obviously you don't want to hate someone, but I'm just saying, like, if I end up hating this person, how do I want to have this contract written up to protect me and them?
Exactly. And I think something else I heard recently too that's really helpful to think of is that it's okay to grow out of a partnership too. I mean, if you get to a point where you have the income or you have the resources to go ahead and fund your own deals, or you have the knowledge, there's no need to have a partner in some of those circumstances. And so even if you aren't ending a partnership on bad terms, you can still kind of have this clean exit just by knowing that, hey, this is something I can do on my own now. And there's no need to give up, half of the deals anymore, because over time and over a bunch of properties, that becomes pretty significant. But the most important thing is having an exit, like you said, and having something that's written and agreed upon so that you aren't both left feeling like you don't have an out.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I have a business with my brother, and we have a very clear, this is in our LLCs, it's very clear what his responsibility, my responsibility is, and if I don't follow my responsibility, he can do X, Y, and Z, and so and it's very important to get everything written down, so it's highly recommend for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I think for me too, with all of these various ways of funding that I've spelled out, I think the thing I just want to reiterate again is just talk to a professional on all of these. I've done all of these, but I don't consider myself an expert on any of them. If you're curious about these different types of loans, curious about partnerships, hard money, private money, definitely reach out to people in your network who have done these, because chances are that most people who have invested in any significant way have used one or more of these strategies. And so it's really important to talk to people who know what they're doing, to do all the research on your own so that you know exactly what you're getting into, because every different product out there, every different arrangement has all kinds of different pitfalls and things to be aware of. And so, yeah, definitely use this as just an overview and do your research to learn more about these strategies. But also, on the same token, never feel like you don't have a way to fund a deal. That's something that I think I struggled with for a while, just feeling like, man, I want to grow, but how do I do this? There are so many ways out there. There are ways that I did not list that will allow you to keep growing and to achieve whatever you're hoping to do with real estate or with other businesses too. I mean, money is kind of that enabler that helps you to get to the next level.
Oh, for sure. It's a matter of your mindset. It's not like, oh, I can't afford this. It's how can I afford this, or how can I make this work? So, and you've given all of us 15 different ways, and there's more, like you said, even more ways of doing it. So, wow. First of all, thank you for coming on. This has been a wealth of knowledge. Like, honestly, it's been great.
Oh,
I've learned a bunch of stuff too, and some other ways I didn't even think about. You know what I mean? So. This has been phenomenal. Where can our listeners get a hold of you if you want to, if they're interested, maybe even being a partner with you or something along those lines? Where can they get a hold of you? Like social media or whatever?
Yeah, sure. So I have several different ways. I'm pretty active on Instagram, so my handle's just at SHZCHIU. So you can reach me there, or by email is fine too. It's just peak360utah@gmail.com. So yeah, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer any questions, happy to help people get started. There's just so much to learn when you're first beginning. And I know that having a mentor for me was huge. Just having somebody to kind of hold your hand through those first steps and to make sure that you're on the right track is crucial, especially when you're making, such huge purchases. For most people, buying homes are going to be some of the largest purchases that you'll make in your life. So definitely reach out. I'm happy to answer questions and to help however I can.
Okay, beautiful.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us. That was some great information. I loved it.
Yeah, thank you guys. No, I appreciate it.
It was fantastic. So for all our listeners, we appreciate you guys chiming in and taking listening and getting to this point. As always, if you're watching this on Facebook or YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. If you're listening to this in any of the podcast formats, make sure to like and subscribe as well. And make sure to share. It really helps out the channel and give us the highest ratings possibly can. Thank you, guys. We love you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We hope you liked that podcast. Stay tuned for next Monday for a brand new podcast and a brand new guest. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share.